Hello. In this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at some challenges to the utilitarian moral theory. The first thing to say when taking a look at objections to a moral theory is especially objections to utilitarianism, the first of the major moral theories you've seen in this course, is that these objections are of a different kind than some of the problems with previous ideas about morality, such as ideas about moral subjectivism or moral relativism or the divine command theory. The objections that we saw to some of those views are bad enough that they don't allow those views to get off the ground. Utilitarianism all by itself is a pretty plausible theory about morality, though it is not a perfect theory about morality. And these challenges illustrate the ways in which utilitarian isn't perfect, although in each case, utilitarians have some reasonable reply to these objections, right? These objections do not prevent utilitarianism from still being a fairly reasonable moral theory. And so it's very important to understand these kinds of challenges so that we can understand utilitarianism all the better, and also understand other moral theories that develop as a kind of response to the utilitarian moral theory. And so the other thing I want to point out is that the authors of two of the required readings, right? Notice this section would seem to be, sort of the enemies of utilitarianism strike or something like that. But that's not exactly the way that this works. In fact, both of the required readings are written by utilitarians, and they're written with the express purpose, right, of presenting utilitarianism in a particular kind of light. But through each of those writings, and we'll talk about each of them as we go through this particular lecture, they each illustrate something about utilitarianism that people have reasonably objected to, but that the utilitarian believes that they have a reasonable response for. So in taking a look at objections to utilitarianism, I'm going to take a look at a couple that are not in the course reading, right? They're to be found here and here only, because they can be explained reasonably well. So the first of those is a fairly famous objection, and it's called the philosophy of swine objection. This objection was described and replied to by John Stuart Mill in last week's optional reading, right? The Utilitarianism, especially Chapter 2 is where you find this. Basically the objection goes this way, right? It says that the life of pleasure, okay, is the life of a pig in slop and not fit for a human. Now remember that classical utilitarians are hedonists, right? They think of pleasure as the only intrinsic good and pain as the only intrinsic evil, and then basically decide to use the consequences in terms of pleasures and pains to add up what kinds of total consequences there are and pick the single outcome that has the best overall consequences. This is an objection to the hedonism part of classical utilitarianism. It says that this idea that pleasure and pain is what you have to focus on sort of, has the wrong idea about what's actually sort of good for a person. Now, the reply to this objection is owed to this fella here with the sort of Three Stooges haircut. His name is John Stuart Mill. He's a British philosopher that lived from 1804 to 1873. And there's a sort of fun story about his origins and his young life. He's the son of the author James Mill, who you may or may not have heard of. And James Mill was a very close friend of Jeremy Bentham, who figured very prominently in last week's readings about the way that utilitarianism works. Now, one of the things that Bentham often did when he got into arguments with people about utilitarianism as a moral theory is that people would say, well, gosh, it sounds so strange to think about morality this way as opposed to the way that we've usually thought. And he's like, yes, but if you were raised to think like a utilitarian, some of these objections would not seem weird to you at all, or the way that utilitarianism works would not seem odd at all. And so he always did sort of wish that people had been, taught from earlier ages to think of the overall consequences, right? And to think of morality in those kinds of terms, right? To think in terms of totaling up pleasures and pains, etc. And as lo and behold, right? James Mill, his best pal, has a son, little John Stuart, and Many intellectuals do this, right? And I think, not just intellectuals, certainly, but people tend to sort of experiment with their children. They, say, well, look, we can, raise them to be a certain way. It's our child. It's, we can do this. And so Bentham and Mill have this idea for raising the perfect utilitarian in John Stuart Mill, and they raised him to be this great, the great defender of utilitarian moral theory. And so from a very early age, he was a very bright child. He was given, the best education they could have, largely, kept in somewhat in isolation from other children, so as not to sort of, corrupt the whole experiment. He was pushed very hard, and at this point, you're probably thinking of, the story is not going to have a very happy ending, right? Where eventually what I'm going to say is, oh, and he ended up having a nervous breakdown and going crazy, and from all this pressure that was put on him by his father and Bentham, his godfather. Well, not really, actually. I mean, if you read biographies or, various accounts of his young life, there's this period of time right around when he's 19 where he kind of, rebels against everything and, renounces utilitarianism and goes off and drinks a lot of beer and plays a lot of pool or whatever, right? I mean, and some people will point to that as this kind of nervous breakdown, and I kind of think it's just him being 19. Because, by the time, if you take his entire life, his entire career, and look at it as a whole, this worked brilliantly. He really is regarded by most as one of the most substantial defenders of utilitarian moral theory, and he was one of the most famous intellectuals of his day, and he had a long and happy life and a productive career. So it worked out just fine for John Stuart. But this is his objection then to the philosophy of Swine objection. He begins his reply with the following. Now you'll notice some of the text in this particular lecture is in blue. I've decided to highlight where utilitarians are responding to objections with blue text, whereas where you see black text, objections are being explained. Okay, so that'll help you try and keep things separated between sort of a claim response. Okay. And so because this is a reply to the philosophy of Swine objection, the text is here in blue. And so so Mill begins this way with this fork. He says, on the first prong of the fork is as follows. He says, if it's true that the pleasures that satisfy a pig are the same ones that satisfy a human, then our being offended by this is just arrogance, right? We've just got to get over ourselves. Okay. And so think about it this way: if the best life for a pig and the best life for a person really were the same, then it's really not an objection, right? If somebody points out that that's the case, right? Then all they're doing is speaking an uncomfortable truth, and we need to get over ourselves and just sort of get used to the truth. Now, of course, Mill doesn't think that this is true. He does not think that the pleasures that satisfy a pig are the same ones that satisfy a human. And so, but you have to cover that possibility. He says, okay, so if that's what's going on, well, then there's no objection to utilitarianism. But if it's true, okay, that the pleasures that satisfy a pig are not the same as the pleasures that satisfy a human, then it's not really an objection to utilitarianism in that case either. As long as a utilitarian can account for the difference, right? The difference between the kinds of pleasures that really are, that do satisfy a human being, that are good for a human being, and the kinds of pleasures that are good for a pig. And this is how Mill does that. Here's how he accounts for the difference. He makes a distinction between the qualities of pleasures. Remember, Bentham only talked about the quantity of pleasure. How much, right? How intense is it? How long does it last? How pure is it? Does it generate more of the same? Does it, et cetera? How many people does it affect? It's all about quantity with Bentham. And it's not like Bentham never thought about a distinction between the qualities and quantities of pleasure. He did, and he rejected it, right? Mill thinks that he was perhaps a little bit hasty. So there are disagreements, of course, between Mill and Bentham in terms of how it's best to be a utilitarian. In this case, this is one of those disagreements. But Mill makes this distinction between these higher quality pleasures, these pleasures that are more refined and more fit for human well-being, and these low quality pleasures which are very much more basic and more animal. Okay. And here's what he says about those things. He says that nobody, right, if you gave them the option, would become an animal even if they were to get the full quantity of animal pleasures, right? So if you think about your house pets, or, when I certainly think about mine, they've got a pretty good life, right? They wake up, in a comfortable place. They get to just kind of wander around. They get everything taken care of for them. They get to eat their food. They get to look out their window. They have a pretty good life, right? Their needs are taken care of, and they're by all evidence happy little critters. But I don't really think I'd trade places with them. I mean, there are some days where it seems like more tempting than others, but for the most part, I would think I would think that I had lost something important. And I think I'd be right to have thought I lost something important. And likewise, Mill says that no intelligent person would consent to become a fool, even if they could be assured that fools have more fun. Right? And that no educated person would give up all of their learning, even if they were sure that ignoramuses were more satisfied with their lives. Right? He sort of sums it all up with a quote: "Better Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." Okay, this is what he means by these more higher quality, more refined pleasures, right? These sort of things that it takes some intellectual development. Like these kinds of pleasures, he says, are more valuable. They're of higher quality. So even if you have less somehow total pleasure, the kind of pleasure that it is going to matter. Right, and so that's how Mill answers this philosophy of swine objection, and in so doing, he takes utilitarianism sort of down this path where it's the quality of pleasure that really makes a bigger difference than any of the quantities of pleasure. And what's notable is that a great many, there are some contemporary utilitarians, that is, utilitarians that are sort of living and working nowadays, that follow him in that, but most don't, right? Most end up thinking that Bentham had the right of it, and that these sort of qualities of pleasure are not really not really part of utilitarianism. But again, this is one how sometimes an objection can sort of make a theory go off onto a different path. All right, the optional reading is from a fellow by the name of Bernard Williams, who makes these really, really famous objections to utilitarianism, right? So if you're going to take an ethics course from anybody, anywhere, odds are at some point you're going to run into, once you do utilitarianism, you're going to run into Bernard Williams's specific objections to it, whether they're directly from Williams, whether they're paraphrased from Williams or something. You're going to run into these at some point, and here you go. Here they are now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paraphrase the test cases that he writes about here, because in their original they're somewhat insensitive in terms of their attitudes about race and gender. So I'm going to, again, and none of those features are really critical to their use as examples. So I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. So basically, Williams gives us two kind of, again, thought experiments. He gives us the case of Jim and the case of George. Right. Jim's case is as follows. Right. Jim gets lost while on a botanical research expedition and ends up stumbling upon some village. In that village, a uniformed person is about to execute 20 villagers for sedition. When the uniformed person notices Jim, Jim is given the option, as an honored guest, to execute one of the villagers himself, after which all the other villagers will be released. Okay. And of course, Williams closes off a few other options. He says, "Oh yeah, these villagers are saying, yeah, please, please, do this to save some of our people, right?" And there's no ideas of sort of schoolboy fantasy of him like going Rambo or something and saving the day or something like that. That's not a realistic option. It's not even realistic in the movies. But it is entertaining. And so again, the question is then, what should Jim do, right? This serious ethical question here. The case of George is as follows. George is a chemist looking for work. A friend of his offers him a job at a company that does research into chemical weapons for military applications. Now, George is very strongly morally opposed to chemical warfare. Now, knowing this, George's friend confides in him that the other leading candidate for the job, who's not named in Williams's example, but let's give him a name. Let's call him Fritz. Fritz is quite enthusiastic about chemical weapons and would not only be zealous about developing them, but would also be very active in campaigning for their use. Now, notice my choice of the name Fritz here is not entirely accidental. The actual sort of pioneer of chemical warfare in the 20th century was a fellow by the name of Fritz Haber, who was a German chemist who invented some of the chemical weapon gases that were very infamously used in World War I. And Fritz himself was quite zealous about developing them and also campaigned for their increased, he thought they should have been used a lot more than they were. So not a great guy. In any case, the question is, what should George do? Right? Should he take the job? Should he not take the job? What's going on here? Well, Williams generates several objections from these test cases. Right? The first of those has to do with utilitarian moral thinking. Right? And so it's pretty clear to everyone who reads such cases and really thinks about them that these are actually difficult moral problems. Right? There's something to be said either way, right? So in Jim's case, sure, having the outcome of saving a net 19 lives is certainly a good thing, but stepping into a situation and killing somebody, right, that's pretty tough, right? That's not something where you would hope someone would say, oh yeah, totally, hand over the gun, right? That's a tough one, right? And likewise, George's case is like, okay, look, if I don't take the job, somebody else might take it who would do far worse things. But on the other hand, if I take it, my job is still to be trying to develop chemical weapons. Like, so again, it's far from an easy, open and shut, simple. These are not simple cases, right? But according to the utilitarian moral theory, they're pretty easy calls, right? Jim should execute one of the villagers, and George should take the job, right? I mean, again, if you just look at overall consequences, totally easy. And so this tension between how easy of a decision these things are, or how simple these cases are, shows that there's a large amount of distance between our our considered moral judgments and utilitarian moral judgments. And so the conclusion is there must be something wrong with the utilitarian thought process. Okay. So that's Williams's first objection that he draws out of these cases. There are two more. The second one can be called the remote effects objection, or the remote psychological effects objection, if you're getting, if you're not into the whole brevity thing. So again, if we go back to those examples, it's easy to see that George and Jim would experience some pretty serious moral guilt from doing as the utilitarian would do. Okay, so Jim, if he kills one of these villagers himself, you can imagine him having some really serious moral guilt about having killed somebody. Even if he can sort of tell himself, look, it really did have the best overall consequences. There really were 19 people that didn't have to die. But again, the idea of having to kill someone himself, you might imagine he would have some really serious trouble with that. The same thing with George. You can imagine going to work every day, right, having serious moral troubles with what he was doing, even if he thought it was on balance the thing that had the best overall consequences. And so this kind of guilt, right, these kinds of remote psychological effects, these psychological effects that are sort of more removed from the original situation, hence remote, there are two potential problems we get from this. The first is again a problem of motivation. It seems like whoever could just execute somebody or research chemical weapons with no qualms at all is pretty clearly not a great moral example, right? Again, I think we would have really serious reservations about being around somebody who, in Jim's case, would be like, "Yep, give me the gun. I'll take care of it." Happily, right? And someone who's like, "Yeah, totally. I'll totally research, chemical warfare. How cool, right?" I mean, again, these are not great moral examples, and so again, there may be something wrong with utilitarian moral thinking, because these choices do have pretty clear utilitarian outcomes. And the second problem is that we would also have to weigh all of these non-utilitarian attitudes in the calculus. So again, imagine that, for example, all the pain and suffering that Jim goes through, maybe he's just never really able to sleep again quite right. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees the face of the person that he murdered, right? And again, the fact that those other 19 live, well, maybe they were living in a pretty repressed, in a pretty oppressive government where they, ended up all being executed for some other thing, even at a fairly near point in the future. And so, it turns out in the end that maybe his intervention didn't have, all that great of an effect. And the cost of it is now this, again, lifetime of crippling guilt or something like that. Well, it seems like you'd have to weigh that as a utilitarian, because that kind of serious guilt counts as a pain, right? It counts as something bad, or it counts as an evil for the utilitarian on the calculus. The trouble is, if you have to weigh these expressly non-utilitarian attitudes, then it sort of opens the door for all kinds of other irrational attitudes to affect this calculus. Like what happens if some people are just sort of irrationally cheered by, sort of blatant acts of racism or something like that. This is, should we consider those kinds of pleasures as sort of valid or rational pleasures for a utilitarian to consider? And I think you could perhaps see the trouble. So again, the trouble is very much a problem of motivation for somebody following the utilitarian moral theory. William's third objection, you can call it the integrity objection. And again, when we look back at these examples, we see that George and Jim are both asked to violate various kinds of commitments they have, right? And our common moral experience does indicate that these kinds of commitments, for example, to peacefulness, or commitments against the idea of weapons of mass destruction, or commitments in favor of justice and fairness, right? All these kinds of personal commitments are an important part of common moral experience. However, no purely consequentialist theory of morality would seem to be able to allow these kinds of commitments, right? It doesn't seem to allow us to, under all circumstances, never support chemical weapons research, because we have cases like George's, or under all circumstances vow never to kill anybody, because again, you have circumstances like Jim's. And this is a problem for any consequentialist theory, not just utilitarianism, but it is also an issue for utilitarians. I'll say here that this is very closely related to the flexibility objection that we're going to be taking a look at late in this lecture. And so finally, the conclusion is that something, of course, then must be wrong with then purely consequentialist moral theories like utilitarianism, is because they don't allow a personal integrity in this way. They don't allow these kinds of commitments that we think are an important part of morality. So in George's case, a commitment not to assist people in developing and using weapons of mass destruction, and in the case of Jim, a commitment to not killing people. Right. So all three of these, again, have a lot to do with utilitarian motivation, right? These are objections to the use of utilitarianism as an action guiding principle, right? And most modern utilitarians view utilitarianism as a criterion of rightness rather than as an action guiding principle. So the way that most modern utilitarians respond to the kinds of objections that, say, for example, Bernard Williams brings about, is that they say that what's going on here is that these kinds of objections occur when you think explicitly in terms of utilitarianism, right? When you think at all times, gosh, I have to bring about the best overall consequences at every second, of every moment of every day, and that's how I have to explicitly think about things. Again, most modern utilitarians don't think that that's the best way to use utilitarianism. They think instead it's a criterion of rightness as opposed to an action guiding principle. They said that what makes an action right or wrong is that it either does or does not generate the best overall consequences. Whatever method you use to generate your actions or use to decide what to do, use whatever method actually works, so long as that method, whatever it is, actually does tend to bring about the best overall consequences. It may be that thinking about the best overall consequences isn't the best approach to doing that, right? So think of it something like a follow through in a golf swing or something. I mean, look, physics tells us that absolutely nothing you do after the club hits the ball matters at all to the way the ball goes. But it may be that aiming for a good follow through makes it more likely that you'll make the right kind of contact, right? That's the best analogy I can give you for this. So again, maybe thinking about personal virtue, or maybe thinking in terms of important commitments, or maybe some other form of decision procedure actually does have the best overall consequences, and then that should be the thing you should do, right, as a utilitarian, not necessarily think about the consequences directly all the time. Thinking about the consequences may, paradoxically, not be the best way to get the best overall consequences. But the utilitarian is still going to maintain that it's still the consequences that ultimately matter. However you go about governing your life, if, in other words, however you actually make decisions about morality, if your decisions are not tending to have the best consequences, then you should think about morality some other way until however you're thinking about it does have the best overall consequences. Because ultimately, after your actions, the world is either a better place or a worse place. And it does seem sensible to say that all of your actions should aim at making the world as good as it can be. And so this kind of call and response illustrates something very interesting about the way that people tend to argue about morality. And you'll see this raise itself up in some other places in this course, and if you sort of haven't already. On the one hand, some people, including Williams, say that if some moral theory conflicts with our considered moral judgments, right? A considered moral judgment is what happens when you're thinking very, very carefully about a particular kind of moral case, right? When you're really thinking, for a long period of time about it, when you've removed distractions, tried to remove various sources of, bias, when you've, thought through the situation, kind of looked at some arguments for, looked at some arguments against. That's a considered moral judgment, okay? And so if some theory conflicts with our considered moral judgments, then so much the worse for that theory. Okay, we should find a better moral theory. And I think you can see that that's exactly what Williams has been saying about utilitarianism in some of these objections, right? If utilitarianism says that certain kind of cases are really easy when we don't think they are, or when utilitarianism says that we ought to just give up these kinds of commitments, when we don't think we should, etc., right? These are ways in which, again, our considered moral judgments can conflict, right, with utilitarianism. Then so much the worse for utilitarianism. Right. Others, right, including most utilitarians, will say that if some sensible moral theory conflicts with our considered moral judgments, well, then so much the worse for our considered moral judgments. We should change our minds, right? This is, like I said, this is a very, very deep disagreement, right, about how we ought to approach morality. Should we use our considered moral judgment to evaluate moral theory, or should we use moral theory to evaluate our considered moral judgment, right? And it's one of those things where you'll see some degree of each of those things being done, and I think that this particular divide is very stark in the case of utilitarians and their objectors, right? But you'll see it happen with respect to some other moral theories as well. And I'll just say, this is ongoing. Nobody knows the answer to this debate, right? It's I would say one of the really most basic divides in thinking about morality, because there's something to be said for either of these approaches. Okay. So the last objection that is not really, the second objection that's not really in the reading that I want to take a look at is this objection to impartiality. Okay. So we mentioned in the last unit that utilitarianism is impartial in the sense that everybody's pains and pleasures are considered. They're weighed, right? They're all weighed, more or less equally. And so if something is really bad for one person, but really good for basically everybody else, well, it's not that person doesn't count, but their pleasures and pains were considered, right? Being considered, it's not the same thing as they were outweighed, right? Being outweighed is not the same thing as being not considered. And so again, utilitarianism is very impartial. It doesn't consider that pleasures and pains of yours, of your family members, of your friends, people you like, are any more or less important than pains and pleasures of people you've never even met, right, or never will. And so again, utilitarianism is very impartial in that sense. But there's a question of whether it's too impartial, right? This actually also comes from Bernard Williams, but just not in the readings that are sort of up here. The objection is kind of like this. So imagine a couple of people are drowning at sea. And imagine that your boat can only get to one of them before they drown. You are equally close to both of them. One of those people is your spouse, right, the person you're married to, and the other is a stranger. Okay. Most people find this to be a very easy decision, but of course the utilitarian has one thought too many. That's a quote from Bernard Williams when he presented this example. So think about this for a second. Think about how the utilitarian would have to evaluate this decision, right? They'd say, okay, look, there's these two people, one of them I know, one of them's a stranger. Now, of course, I would be, very sad, and your spouse's family, other family would presumably be very sad if they drowned. But of course, there's a pretty equal chance that this stranger has, the same family, right? The same number of people who would be just as sad if they died. And so again, you want to say, like, the odds are, right, that they've got the same sort of a problem there. So that's a kind of tie, right? And you say, okay, well, look, if my spouse is a really good person, is working on very important things that will, benefit the world, that would be great. But of course, you don't know that, you don't know what the stranger's like either. I mean, maybe they're, just a truly awful person, right? But you don't know. They're perhaps even a greater person than anybody else. Maybe they're the most, the most important person for the whole future of the world or something like that. You just don't know. And so given the lack of information, again, you're going to have to call it a tie. You want to say, on balance, the likelihood is that they're more or less as morally good, or sort of, morally saving them will have the same sort of moral impact as saving your spouse, right, on the rest of the world. And so you go down the list, right? All the possible things you could consider, all the possible consequences and consequences of consequences, right? And you do this very quickly because you're a really well-trained utilitarian. You've spent a lot of time, practicing, and then you get, finally to the end here, like, okay, last tiebreaker is, I know my spouse, right? And so I guess that's it. It's just the last tiebreaker is that, that has some impact on me, and so I'm going to go ahead and save them instead of the stranger. Okay. And so then imagine you row your boat over to them, right? And you get there just in the nick of time, and you pull them into the boat, and they cough and sputter for a while, and then they say, "Oh, thank you for saving me." And you say, "Well, it came down to the last tiebreaker to come after you." And you imagine this person will feel very good about that. And so again, it seems like it's one thought too many, right? Or several thoughts too many, rather, for the case of the utilitarian. So again, there's this idea about utilitarian motivation. And again, the reply is, that despite its strangeness in some cases, everybody who really thought like a utilitarian would actually not find anything strange about this, right? It's just one of those things where, look, just because you're not used to thinking that way doesn't mean it's wrong to think that way. And so again, this is a motivation issue. All right, so I've saved the biggest ones for last, the most important ones for the last couple of objections we're going to take a look at. And these also have to do with positive features. Remember, one of the things that lots of people like about utilitarianism is its demandingness, right? It's that it really asks a lot of us. It really gives us a great moral ideal. It really, it has something to say about all possible circumstances, because everything has a consequence of one kind or other. And so utilitarianism is absolutely demanding. The question is it too demanding? So the objection in this case says that utilitarianism is too demanding on our actions because it would require us to always do that which had the best overall consequences. Always, always, always. And when you think about how much this might require, that really might be quite a lot. Right. And so my favorite example of this is that, just think of breakfast, right? What did you have for breakfast this morning, right? And so it might be, I put a Pop-Tart in the toaster, right? Because if you're eating a Pop-Tart without a toaster, you're barbarian, right? So get a toaster, for goodness sakes. Take the extra 90 seconds or whatever it is, and eat like a civilized person. And so, but yeah, imagine that's what you did, right? well, could you have woken up a little earlier and made, like made eggs for whoever you might live with, right? Or cinnamon rolls or something like that. Could you have made a whole pan of cinnamon rolls while you were at it, and by waking up just a little earlier, and then sort of gone out and distributed those things to to friends, relatives, neighbors, whatever, right? Of course, being very careful in these days. Yeah, and again, I think at all times you can think of something that you could have done other than what you did that would have had more happiness in the world as a result. Okay. And it seems like what utilitarianism is saying is that you screwed up, right? That you really should have done all those things that and again, it doesn't take a lot of imagination. You can probably think of 100 different things every day that you could have done differently. You did have enough time, you did have enough resources, you did have enough of whatever to make that much more pleasure in the world than you in fact did. And so again, utilitarianism would say that you're morally obligated to do so. Like, you screwed up if you didn't do all of those things. And so that's a sense in which that's a lot, right? That's quite a lot that utilitarianism can ask of you. But of course, utilitarians know this, and they say, their reply is just, yeah, what do you want from us, right? Yeah, it might be practically non-feasible, but don't we want a moral ideal, even if that ideal is practically out of reach? Right? Don't we want a moral theory to tell us to really give us a standard, to really tell us what would be morally perfect, even though we know we're never going to get to moral perfection, right? Why dumb down the whole, the ideal at this point, or scale it down? What we ought to be doing is trying to scale ourselves up so that we get closer to it, even if we know that we can't quite ever get there. And that seems like a sensible reply here. For example, I mean, we do still bother with having laws, even though we know that there will always be lawbreakers, right? I mean, it's not like we can say, people are, nobody's ever going to, we're never going to have a perfectly, law-abiding society. Why even bother, right? Okay, so what we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good here. And so, yeah, maybe perfect action is not practical, okay? But that doesn't mean that our action can't be better. That doesn't mean that it can't be, that we shouldn't try and make it as good as it can be. And so that's, again, a plausible response that the utilitarian has. So a stronger way, I think, to phrase the demandingness problem is this way. And actually, we're going to talk about Peter Singer's article here in just a second after we rephrase the demandingness objection. So think of it this way. Utilitarianism makes the optimific action, that is, the action that has the best overall consequences of any available option, it makes that the only morally acceptable action all the time. So what that means is that there are no supererogatory actions. Okay, that is, a supererogatory is one of those fun words that you can use to impress your friends later. Supererogatory means sort of above duty, right? That super means above, right? And then that's a word for meaning duty. So supererogatory action is something that goes beyond your duty, right? So these are actions that are praiseworthy, but that go beyond what's morally required. So imagine some good friend of mine, has some form of a condition and they need a kidney, and it turns out that I'm an acceptable donor. It would surely be very nice of me to donate my kidney to this person, or even a perfect stranger, right? But am I morally required to do so? I think mostly we would say no. So this is an example, right, of something that is supererogatory. Right, that is above and beyond the call of duty. Something that's very good to do, but not morally required to do. All right, and common moral experience says that there are a lot of things that are that way, and we tend to think of things like charity as being something like that. So this objection, this demandingness objection, really goes well along with Peter Singer's piece about world poverty, right? So when you read this, it should be noted that Peter Singer is himself a utilitarian. Singer's a committed utilitarian, probably the most famous living utilitarian. He gives lectures all the time. He writes many, many articles advocating a general utilitarian moral approach. And you can see the utilitarianness of his theory about world poverty. In fact, he's giving us an argument that says, look, every time you spend any money on something you don't actually need, think about how much more good that exact same amount of money could have done if it was given to somebody who, for example, doesn't have adequate medical care, doesn't have enough food, right? Doesn't have any shelter. Again, imagine you're desperate halfway around the world. Perhaps your family is a refugee from a war zone, and you've got you're hungry. You're kind of living in makeshift shelters. And so imagine what the cost of an iPad would do for you, right? Meanwhile, most people who buy iPads don't strictly need them. I mean, sometimes you can say that you do, but most of the time, it's not a need, it's a luxury, right? Or if you think about sort of a designer pair of jeans, right? That's a luxury item, right? It's an item that nobody needs. But for that cost, just imagine, right, how much good could be done other than. So again, that's a utilitarian argument. So instead of doing this thing that only generated a little bit of good, a fleeting amount of pleasure for yourself, you should have done something with those same resources that brought about a great deal of good, right, for somewhere. Right? So that's the idea. That's Singer's argument, and he's pretty unapologetic about it, right? So again, he represents the utilitarian side of this action. And I think it's very clear that people have, when you read an article like this one, I think you can have really serious misgivings about how demanding utilitarianism really is. But I think it should be clear that the demandingness of utilitarianism, even if it presents a problem that utilitarianism might have, doesn't necessarily disqualify it as a good moral theory. After all, the utilitarian has a reasonable reply here, and it's exactly what Singer says. He says, look, again, it's true that utilitarianism would take this thing, this charity, for example, which we normally think of as supererogatory, as a thing that's really nice to do, but that you're not morally obligated to do, and it would absolutely make it something that you're morally obligated to do, right? And Singer suggests that it's actually a moral defect to think that morality is in some degree optional, right? To think that your obligation to do the most good that you can is somehow a thing that would be nice if you did, instead of a thing that you really are morally obligated to do. So again, and Singer's quite serious about this. And if you were wondering whether Singer himself lived this way, the answer is yes. You can look it up. He lives a very, very basic lifestyle and gives away the vast majority of everything that he earns. It's a committed moral stance, and it's not clear that it's the wrong one. Even if you could understand why somebody might object to utilitarianism's being too demanding. Finally, I've again left what I think is the most substantial objection to utilitarianism for the last one, right? And it's the flexibility objection. And the objection is something like this: utilitarianism is flexible, which is actually something that utilitarians really like about it, something people generally like about utilitarianism. The question is it too flexible? Remember, the flexibility of utilitarianism is the idea that utilitarians don't say that there's any particular action that's always right or always wrong. So something like lying, for example, is not always right, and it's not always wrong. It's most often wrong, because most often lies cause worse overall consequences than the truth. But every now and then you can imagine a circumstance where a lie might actually bring about the best overall consequences. And so in those cases, that's what you're required to do, because again, it's about the best overall consequences, not about what kind of action it is at any specific time. And so here's the objection. Okay, so imagine if some exotic situation arose in which, for example, killing somebody, right, or perhaps torturing them or something like that, right, something very clearly, right, that would ordinarily be immoral, in and of itself. Imagine that some situation in which killing someone or torturing them or whatever led to the best overall consequences of any available action. right? As in like, whatever, all of your available options, right? And it turns out that the one that actually has the best overall consequences is murdering some innocent person. Then not only would utilitarianism allow that action, it would require it. Okay, that would be the morally correct action. Everything else would not be. And that sounds absurd, right? It sounds absurd that any moral theory should condone things like killing innocent people or torturing people or something like that, right? But of course, it's a piece of utilitarianism. And of course, the reply is a little bit more nuanced and much more complicated. But very briefly, the reply is that it really only sounds absurd, right, if you think that there's something more to morality than the best overall consequences, right? So yes, the method for getting there may sometimes be really awful, right? And certainly should be the sort of thing that you should take notice of. But look, ultimately, you have to care enough about everybody, right, to be able to choose in some weird cases the lesser of two evils, right? And that, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound quite so horrendous, right? But this is one of those that can really get that way. And so again, for a much more thorough and thought-provoking analysis of the topic, what I want you to pay really close attention to J.J.C. Smart's work on the problem of utilitarianism and justice in his reading. Now again, J.J.C. Smart is himself a committed utilitarian, right? Is arguing in favor of the utilitarian moral theory here, and he's explaining. He spends most of the first part of his reading explaining this kind of an objection. And the case that he uses is the case of a sheriff, right? Who, you can read the case for yourself, but the short version is that this sheriff is put in a situation where the action with the best overall consequences is to kill some innocent person that is in his custody to try and essentially disperse a riot from the townspeople who think incorrectly that this person is guilty of some horrible crime. So again, you can tell whatever story you like, right? But it's simply logically possible that in some situation killing an innocent person could potentially be the action that has the best overall consequences. And so J.J.C. Smart has to then reply, right, to, from a utilitarian perspective, to why that kind of an issue does not necessarily mean that utilitarianism is a defunct or bankrupt moral theory. And so again, there's a lot of nuance there, and you really got to look at the article very carefully. But I want to highlight a couple of things about how Smart proceeds there. One of the things he brings up is this idea that sometimes you would think of a person who could do such a thing, who could say kill some innocent person for the best overall consequences, as being sort of very heartless or cynical or something like that. Whereas Smart says, look, even in his most utilitarian moods, he's not happy about this conclusion, but neither would he be happy with preferring worse overall consequences to everybody else, right? It says you could only, the way that he defines utilitarianism as what he calls generalized benevolence, that is caring enough about everybody, right? So that you don't focus too much, right, on something that might be completely unjust, right, that happens to this innocent person, but instead also consider the impacts of all of your actions on everybody else, how much actual good your actions do versus how much actual harm your actions do. And he thinks it's just not crazy, all right, to prefer the action that has the best overall consequences, even when those actions are manifestly unjust, like, for example, killing an innocent person. Manifestly unjust, but again, not necessarily immoral, right? Again, depending on whether utilitarianism succeeds or fails in cases like this. So again, really important reading, and I can't say enough how much you really want to take a look at the detail. And of course, any questions you have about any of these, do please raise those questions, right? This isn't the sort of This isn't the sort of thing that you can just sort of look over once and just sort of passively understand everything, right? It requires a lot of active thought, and that includes asking questions and talking to people about these kinds of things. That's how this material is really absorbed. It's not, it can't be done passively. So finally, I'd like to just summarize some of the big highlights here, some of the big takeaways, what I really want you to focus on. And so one of the things that I want you to notice is that some of these best features of utilitarianism, right, its flexibility, its demandingness, and its impartiality, are also sources of some reasonable objections to utilitarianism. It is flexible, but is it too flexible? It is demanding. Is it too demanding, etc., right? And it's also important to keep track of what these objections are, right? So be able to, when somebody says, oh, the philosophy of swine objection, or oh, the flexibility or objection, or the problem of justice objection, they're, sort of those are two names for the same thing. So you should know what somebody means if they refer to those, right? Because that's how you refer to it. You should probably keep in mind, right, which authors, which writings are associated most closely with which of these objections, how they're presented, how it is that the author goes about explaining the objection, including these relevant thought experiments like the sheriff case, or like the thought experiments that Peter Singer brings up, the many thought experiments he brings up in his article, Williams's experiments that we discussed earlier, etc. Okay. And then finally, you should always keep track of what sorts of replies that the utilitarian has to these various objections. Because the difference between the objections to some of the stuff we saw early in the course and the objections to utilitarianism are that those things early in the course were enough to really disqualify those earlier theories as serious candidates for real, for real moral progress. These objections are important, right? They tell us all the kinds of ways in which utilitarianism is absolutely not perfect, right? But they don't necessarily tell us that utilitarianism is they don't conclusively tell us anyway that utilitarianism is clearly a bad moral theory or clearly should be abandoned or something like that. Again, at each step of the way, it appears as if the utilitarian has at least some reasonable response. It may be that utilitarianism just isn't the best moral theory, but it's at least a candidate, right, for being among the best moral theories. And these kinds of objections are important things to realize to understand better how utilitarianism works, and more specifically, to understand better how moral thinking works, right, or how we can make some kind of progress in trying to determine what the best moral theory is. So given all that, I'd recommend, sort of making some outlines, keeping some good notes about these sorts of things. But these are the categories of things you should focus on in trying to be able to discuss this material effectively.